Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Gabby from She Makes It Work. And tonight we're talking about how our leaders today are failing us. I think that in these changing times at work, and this is specifically about work leadership, and I know that a lot of things are changing right now. We've talked about how the boomers are aging out of the workforce, Gen Z is entering the workforce, we've got AI coming in, we've got a lot of changes with middle management. So, as all of these changes are really facing us and confronting us in the workplace, I think that we would expect our leaders to be doing a better job than they are. And I do have to say, before we get into some of the details, that leaders, of course, they're not perfect, they're human. And so some of the leaders that you may know or that I may know and have worked with might be great in a variety of ways, but still be failing at some really key things. So I just want to say that before we get into it, I'm not trying to tear down our leaders. I'm not trying to say that, they don't do anything well, but I do think that there is some consistent patterns and things that they're not doing well in ways that are really causing employees to struggle and feel disconnected or unsupported or causing some larger scale organizational issues through these failures. So I just want to make sure I preface it with that of course leaders aren't perfect and there's some things that they do well, but it's really important for us to talk about what the gaps are right now because hopefully that leads to conversations where we can start addressing the gaps themselves. I have a really long list, by the way, so I expect this to be the first possibly in a series. And as I'm talking, I would love to hear from y'all. So if I bring up any points, please put some discussion in the chat if there's any thoughts that get prompted. And again, as I'm speaking, if you think of things, feel free to put them in the chat, even if it's on my list later. Put it in the chat and I'll address it because I want to make sure that this is really a dialogue as much as possible. So I'd love to hear from you while I'm talking. And to the point of leaders being imperfect, I do want to say that that actually came up for me when I was a little bit early career, but about ready to transition into leadership. And I was meeting with a career coach to kind of try and figure out what I wanted to do next. And I was expressing some frustrations with my manager at the time, who was human because we all are. And my career coach at the time was like, Gabby, I know you've dealt with a lot of, dealing with perfectionism. She's like, but you are still expecting your leaders to be perfect and they're not. And I was like, yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. And so that was really the first time I confronted the fact that sometimes as employees, we really do expect our leadership to be, frankly, better than they might be or infallible in some ways. And that's normal because in a lot of ways, we're taught to either respect authority as we're growing up, or we do tend to feel like just because someone's above us in the hierarchy, that means that there's something better about them. And usually it means that they have more experience or they know more or they're more skilled at a certain thing, but they're not better than we are as people. And I think that's really important to keep in mind because it really helps our ability to see our leaders as human and take what's good and what works with them and leave the rest. But again, the topic for tonight are patterns that we're seeing in leadership where there are some pretty common struggles right now, again, with the changes in the workplace, with aging workforce and new people entering the workforce and AI and the challenges around the changes in middle management. So let's get started. So one of the things I think is actually really germane today, and that is that our leaders aren't preparing us for conversations about gender struggles in the workplace. And I mean gender struggles as in just differences in approaches, but I also mean things that we as women might experience in the workplace. I think that our leaders don't help us have conversations about that or have a language to discuss that. And as a woman who grew up in technology and switched to consulting and in leadership roles, I can say there are some things that tend to happen. But whenever I've personally tried to talk to the leaders above me about the challenges of being a woman in the workplace, they always try and shut down the conversation or blow it off. And that can manifest in different ways. And when I first was entering the workforce in the corporate world, whenever I thought about gender issues, okay, I'm just going to date myself here a little bit, but I went to high school and college in the 90s. And at the time, the big topic in society was about sexual harassment. And so I thought that sexual harassment was the worst thing that would be gender related in the workplace. But sexual harassment is horrible and it still happens, but that is almost easier to address in some ways because there is a lot more consciousness and conversation around it. So as long as you've got documentation and you handle it correctly, more often than not, that will be handled appropriately. But there are more difficult behaviors in the workplace, and some of them you can experience at any level. Like we always joke about the mansplainers or the man-interrupting, which is the tendency of men to talk over women. But we don't equip women with how to deal with that. And I recognized this pretty early on because we would have these, women in technology groups and women in leadership groups. And I thought that the purpose of those groups was to provide space to discuss that and to share information about how to handle these situations. But even in those contexts, those conversations were shut down. And so it can be really frustrating as a woman to notice that a particular man or men in general are interrupting you and talking over you. And it feels like you have no recourse because it's a little bit harder to prove. It's not like sexual harassment where it's concrete and you can document it. And for the most part, like I said, these days that tends to be taken seriously and for the most part handled appropriately. But those other situations, like, they're just so nebulous. And unfortunately, if you know, demonstrate your very understandable frustration with that, then you're the bad guy. And this is a known thing, right? This is frequently commented on. I've seen a few TikTok videos about it. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But I think what I'm saying is when I talk about leadership failing us, I expect the leaders who came before us to better prepare the women coming up for those situations and prepare them on how to handle them and model the behavior when it happens. Or if more junior women are approaching leaders and saying the situation's happening, what do I do, to be able to give them specific advice. And instead what I'm seeing happen is, and I left the corporate world at like upper middle management, so not true senior leadership in the corporate world. And the senior leaders above me who were women very consistently failed to be able to have this conversation. And I would try and talk to them about it and they would shut it down. And I think that what happens is that, as women rise in the organization, and we know there are far fewer women in leadership positions in pretty much every company. Like any company that has parity is the exception. And we know that it's a unicorn basically. And we lose women along the way. And I think this is one of the reasons we lose women along the way is because there's not enough support for women going through this process and rising through leadership. And the female leaders above them kind of have to pretend like it doesn't happen. They in order to survive like mentally and emotionally, I think that they kind of have to block out that this is the reality. And in order to continue to be accepted within the system, they kind of have to pretend like it doesn't happen. And I do know that for a fact. I've worked with multiple female senior leaders who, they have to get a very thick skin in order to survive, but they don't talk about it. And if you ask them, like I said, they shut the conversation down. But when I observe men doing that to them, they usually just ignore it and don't address it. And so they're not even modeling the behavior for the women in the more junior roles. So what do you learn as a woman in the workplace? You learn that you have to accept this behavior. And like I said, most of the time, if you react to it or complain about it, you're the problem. So I think this is a really serious failure. And I also think that it's a problem because, not to get too much in the weeds, but I think that recent events have shown that younger women aren't prepared for this reality that even if there's a nice face being put on it, that women still aren't treated the same in our society or at work. And I mean the same like equally. I don't mean like, oh, of course we're all different. I mean literally like you have to put up with a lot more stuff and bad behavior, frankly. And if you complain about it, you are the problem. And the common wisdom is if you go to HR will take care of it. And I just want to remind everybody that is not true. HR is there to protect the company. And if you are perceived as a complainer, I will tell you straight up, you're perceived as the risk to the company, not the person doing the bad behavior. So unless there's someone in a position of authority who's a man who does this consistently with a lot of women who are complaining about it, if you're the only one complaining about it, you're the risk to the company. That's really gross and unfortunate and hard to prove, especially if the man who has this bad behavior is above you in the hierarchy. The company will always prioritize protecting him unless his behavior is so egregious and so widespread that he is clearly a risk to the company. Then he will be the one addressed. Otherwise, it's always going to be you who loses. And so if it's this soft behavior, there's so much more risk in complaining about it and going to HR, which again is why a lot of these female leaders are just like, you know, kind of ignore it as long as it's not, really concrete. But they don't even tell you that. They just don't want to talk about it. And I think it's a real disservice because like I said, we're losing a lot of female leaders like as they just kind of give up. A lot of women leave the workforce before they get into more senior leadership positions. And the other thing that we don't talk about enough is that as you rise through the leadership ranks as a woman, your authority is challenged by the men who work for you. And so when we talk about men interrupting you and speaking over you and all of that, a lot of that bad behavior is your peers. It's often not a man who outranks you because they're better at hiding it to some extent. It's your peers who do that. And as you are getting promoted through leadership, it's then your own employees who don't listen to you and who challenge your authority. And it's not just men. And so that's really the challenge is that we're not having open conversations that as female leaders, we are not granted the same foundational level of respect that male leaders at the same level get, meaning a man and a woman side by side with the same job title and same job experience. He's granted more of a halo effect, meaning in this case, meaning that his employees and the people around him grant him more authority and respect. Whereas even once you're at that same level and same experience, you still have to earn it with your team. And the leadership above you will tell you that you have to earn it, that you have to earn their trust and you have to earn their respect. And I don't hear them saying the same things to male leaders. And in the traditional hierarchical executive world, that would be considered insubordination if a man's direct reports, treated him this way. But when you're a woman and your direct reports are treating you this way, nobody says that. They tell you you have to earn the team's respect. So my point isn't to say just that the system is broken. My point is really to say that the leaders who've gone through this and who have passed through this, I think have a responsibility to be able to have this conversation and to be able to not just lift up other women, but also really how do we navigate it? Or isn't it kind of the hope that as women get in more senior leadership positions that they're actually able to help influence and change that? But even when they're in these very senior leadership positions, more often than not, there's always somebody above them, and there's always an HR system above them that does have this bias that I'm describing. So it is a failure of our leaders, and I'm trying to be empathetic about why it happens, but I find it very frustrating. And, as a direct person and as a woman who has her eyes open and can see this and has experienced this at all levels, frankly, I really did try and make a point, whatever level I was at, to lift up women with me, but also to be able to have these open conversations. And sometimes it has to be with really trusted people. But if I had a woman at work who was more junior than I was, who was telling me that, this guy keeps interrupting me, that's doing that, I absolutely tried to tell her how to handle that situation. I didn't just blow her off and hope she made the best of it. And I remember one time I actually had a client and he was a very aggressive man and he really took a dislike to me and he was very loudmouthed and brash, but we were there as the consulting company to drive a bunch of changes and he felt like it threatened his position. And his way of reacting that was to be verbally abusive to me, like literally yelling at me, raised volume, inappropriate words over and over and over again. And I'm the consultant, I'm not an employee of that company, which means I can't go to his HR. That's not how that's handled. And I remember going to a leader above me who to this day is a very good friend of mine. So, like I said, I understand that leaders aren't perfect. But in this case, she did let me down. She was like, Gabby, we just have to deal with that. That's just one of the things we have to deal with as consultants. And I was like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I will not deal with this. And this was at the time working for a very progressive company, a very people first company, a very much like we don't let our consultants get treated poorly. But if you're a woman and you're treated poorly by a man, apparently you do still have to accept it. So I didn't accept it, obviously. Like, no, I went to a different leader and she talked to the client leadership and it was eventually addressed. But it was just really interesting that if you take that, there were two senior leaders above me, and one basically was like, grit your teeth and get through it. And the other was like, I will go handle this. You're lucky if you get the one that says, I'm going to go handle this, is I guess what I'm trying to say. That's still not the norm. So I'd say that is one of my biggest disappointments with our leadership is that not only are they not preparing us for how to handle these situations, but there's obviously like not just a lack of support, but kind of the opposite of support when you're running into these situations. Because in this day and age, that isn't the thought, is that you have to deal with these kinds of things. And I don't think that you have to, and I don't think that you should, especially for a company that touts how they treat their people and how they let their people be treated. So that's not an isolated example, by the way. That is not like the one thing, it happens all the time. I've seen it. I've been involved in multiple of these situations, and it's just the way it is. And one of the best things that you can do, I can't help but be constructive and come out with tips on how to handle things. But one of the best things that you can do is have a very strong network of female leaders, because I have also seen women who have some of these more nebulous situations where it's like poor behavior, but not sexual harassment. That, so one of those kind of harder to talk about situations. And she had a network of female leaders that she was able to go to, and they actually got the situation addressed. But it wasn't, that's why I'm saying it's a network. It wasn't just one. It was really a network of leaders at different levels who supported her through this and took it seriously when she complained about it. So just keep that in mind, that these are tricky situations. And I have to say again, I think the biggest disservice we're doing is not preparing young women for the fact that this is the reality of corporate America. I don't think they're prepared for it. And it's so hidden that it takes years to actually see what's happening. And because the system is kind of gaslighting you to some extent, you think it's just you. You're like, is it just me? Like, this seems so crazy to me, but nobody else seems to think that there's anything wrong. That's a problem. That's what I'm saying, is that no, there is some behavior that happens that we should be preparing young women for, so that they don't think that it's only them and they don't think that they're crazy, and then they don't get blown off when they're trying to ask for help with these really complicated situations. That's my first, how our leaders are failing us. I know that was a big one, kind of started with a bang, and it's hard to talk about. And societally, we're just honestly enculturated not to talk about it. And that's what I'm saying is the failure, is the not talking about it. And she makes it work. That's my thing, is I'm not going to not talk about stuff just because it's uncomfortable or just because other people don't like it or they may not agree with me. I don't care. This is what happens. And we're in the wrong if we're pretending like it's not happened. We're literally gaslighting other women by pretending that this isn't the way it is. So that's the first one. I'd say that my next big way that senior leaders are failing us is that there's so many times where they are not modeling the behavior that they're expecting of us. And this specific scenario is very common with senior leadership and middle management. And what I mean by that is that senior leadership has very high expectations of how middle management coaches their people. This is one of the ways that they're not modeling the behavior. So middle management is expected to be very hands-on coaching and very interested in developing the careers of the people underneath them, and doing this with very little support. And it's not just like, oh, by the time you're middle management, you should know how to do that. I mean that a lot of times middle managers have never had that level of support. They've gotten to their level without having all of this like coaching and handholding. And then the leaders who are currently above them, who have been above them and then risen through the ranks, are the same people who never did it and don't do it now. So middle management is expected to be very skilled at coaching when they've never had the behavior modeled for them. They're supposed to be very supportive of their team members when their leaders are not hands-on supportive of them at all and haven't been for most of their careers. And I think that there's a few things wrong with this, which is that it really makes senior leaders look hypocritical. That's the first thing. And it's really a disconnection as well, because I don't think senior leaders understand how much time and effort goes into actually doing that because they're not doing that. But if you're in middle management and you're working for a company that has this expectation that you're doing this super intense coaching, if you're doing it right, it's your whole day, depending on how big your team is. Like literally, it is your whole day developing the next level of managers underneath you and supporting the people that may not be at that level. And usually in middle management, you've got people at different levels underneath you too. So you're having to stretch and relate to people who are very distant from what you're currently experiencing. And again, that becomes your whole job. You can see my cat on the counter over there. That's Morgan. It becomes your whole job. And you can say, well, Gabby, yeah, that is a manager's job. Yeah, it is a manager's job to support their people, but they usually have functional responsibilities as well. And that's where I'm saying that the expectation of the leadership above them is so disconnected because the senior leaders don't know how time consuming that is and are expecting the middle managers to do this very intense coaching with people of varying levels with pretty large teams, to be honest. And then also have these functional responsibilities, which may be pretty intense too. Because remember, the middle managers, directors, et cetera, they're doing all of their like team planning and the budgeting and the forecasting and pitching the ideas for the team and asking for the money for next year and doing all of the performance reviews and doing whatever it is that the actual business of the company is as well. By the way, it's usually at least half the job. And it's impossible, training the new employees and making all the decks for senior leadership above them and reporting on the results and, going to all these like strategy sessions. Like, yeah, that's the job. But that's what I'm saying is that senior leadership has all these demands of middle management to manage up and have all these demands of middle management to manage down when senior leadership is solely interested in managing up themselves and they do not manage down. So again, it's hypocritical and they're not modeling the behavior, right? Like Amazon, again, is doubling down on not just their return to office, but they continue to say that they're slimming down their middle management to get rid of bureaucracy. And like we talked about in the Gen Z getting fired video, like nobody's there to train the new people when you're slimming down middle management. So it's really bizarre to me that senior leadership has all these expectations that middle management's doing all this. And that in the last like 6 months, now there's this perception that, oh, but it's not needed. We can just get rid of them. These teams will self-organize and Gen Z will train themselves entering the workforce. Like it is literally cuckoo bananas. So, but senior leaders, they can't admit that they don't actually know what's going on with the teams or what their, directors, et cetera, are doing underneath them. So this one is just nuts to me, but it is very frustrating having been in those middle management roles and having people who do not coach their people holding me accountable for coaching my people. So I think that one is a little bit frustrating. Another example of something that senior leaders are doing that is failing us is they really are demanding vulnerability from the leaders. So vulnerability at work has been a big thing for like, I don't know, the last 8-ish years. It's been super big. And I know it's been a buzzword for a while. And what's really frustrating about it is that when you see enough senior leaders and they are trying to model this vulnerability, it's fake. Like, it's fake, and that is really frustrating because they are asking their, leaders underneath them to be vulnerable with them and with their teams, and they don't actually do it themselves in a genuine way. And so it's really interesting because I think that there was this big push in the corporate world to frankly pretend like you could still be authentic and you could still be yourself and be vulnerable and succeed in corporate America. But it's not true. It's really not. It's a huge I hate to say it, it's a huge lie. Because if you look at the senior leaders who are demanding vulnerability from the people underneath them, but then you watch how they're vulnerable, It's very rehearsed and it is safe vulnerability. It is false vulnerability. They tell you something that doesn't actually feel vulnerable, but sounds like it. And they use it as a tool. And that is the most frustrating thing. I was in an executive meeting where one of the C suite executives, this is just an example, I'm telling you all of them do it, but this is a good example. And he was trying to motivate the team, to be okay with less raises and some financial hardships and everything. And he tried to tell this relatable story about growing up poor, and it didn't land well. Everybody walked out of that meeting thinking that it was the most artificial story they'd ever heard because he, I actually don't want to tell you anything else to make it identifying. He has not struggled for money for about 30 years. And so, yes, he may have had some hardship when he was growing up, but it's really the story didn't land well and he was trying to like fake emotion about something that happened like what 40 years ago, and he's flying on private jets and owns some very expensive properties and owns a multi-billion dollar company, and he's trying to convince people that it's okay that cost of living is outpacing their raises because you know sometimes they had to scrimp on food when he was young. And I mean, a lot of us have poverty stories, right? A lot of us had food scarcity when we were growing up. So I'm not being it's not a lack of empathy for his circumstances. It's the fact that he was using that as a tool that's the problem. Does that make sense? Like it was very inauthentic and it wasn't something that was actually truly vulnerable anymore. Like if he had told that story when he was 18 or 25, maybe even 30, it was a vulnerable story then. It isn't now. It really isn't. And it was really disingenuous. So I think that's one of my main issues with that vulnerability is that it is so fake and that all of these leaders actually have a curated set of stories that they rotate. And that's how it comes off as so artificial is that if you're exposed to them enough times, you realize they're telling the same stories over and over again. And they may like tweak them for different contexts and circumstances, but it's not truly vulnerable if it's rehearsed. It's not truly vulnerable if you've been telling the same story for 20 years in every meeting that you're in, right? It's not vulnerable about who you are now. So, yeah, you can tell I'm passionate about this one because as somebody personally, I'm actually fairly reserved at work. Like I may be outgoing and have a big personality, but I'm very reserved about what matters to me. And I had a few peers who were the same way. And so to have people who aren't truly vulnerable with you, pushing you and forcing you to be vulnerable with them, it felt very icky. It actually reminded me of Scientology about how you have to go in and tell your deep, dark secrets and they video you and then they use it against you later. That's actually what it starts to feel like is that people are demanding that you open up to them and frankly bleed for them. And you're like, but you're not exhibiting that same trust with me. You're not being honestly vulnerable with me. So, like, just don't ask me to do it. If you're not going to do it, is really my takeaway. I don't need them to be vulnerable, but don't push me to do it. So, yeah, I really, really dislike that one. Oh my gosh. Another failure right now is accountability. That is just gross to me. So, this is really on my mind because the last 2 years have been, frankly, tumultuous in the business world. And a lot of companies that had been very easily profitable for a very long time, no longer, right? It has been hardship after hardship. And what I've seen is I've seen the most senior executives blaming everybody but themselves, which is wild to me. I literally sat in a meeting a few years ago where the CEO said that we had had some rough times, and the CEO said that there was not a recession coming up and that everybody was just being doom and gloom and that there was no business recession coming up. And then we had the worst year we'd ever had right after that. And then he came back and he said, nobody could have predicted this, even though at the time everybody was like, bro, business is slowing down. Like we see it, we can see it happening. Business is slowing down. We shouldn't overhire. We shouldn't do this. We shouldn't do that. So then, like I said, after the really rough business year, then he comes back and he's like mad at his management team and blaming them. And he's like, we have all this and that. I don't want to reveal too much, but yeah, he was really not taking accountability. And like I said, his take was, well, nobody could have predicted this. I'm like, no, at the time you were mad because everybody kept telling you and you did not believe them. So that would have been a great opportunity to model accountability and say, you know, it was a judgment call and I called it wrong. And now there's, now everybody else has to pay the consequences because the highest leaders didn't get laid off. The middle leaders didn't get laid off. The team members in the company were the ones who got the layoffs because of the poor performance of the company based on leadership decisions. That's not accountability. It isn't. And that is really honestly depressing because I have seen other leaders model true accountability. I've seen other leaders show up and say, I was wrong. I made a bad call. I made a bad decision. I made this choice and it impacted my people. I made this choice and it impacted you, Gabby. Like I've had leaders say that to me, few and far between, unfortunately. And that's the problem is that, if you really care about doing the true work to become a very good leader, accountability is almost number one because who can ever trust you if you don't hold yourself accountable and model accountability? No one should trust you. And there hasn't been a leadership course I've been in that didn't emphasize accountability pretty significantly. And so that becomes really frustrating as you're moving through these leadership ranks. And it's a core value of mine. You can tell I'm so passionate about it. Accountability is a core value of mine. But not only that, it is frustrating that as you're moving through these leadership ranks and you're going through all of this leadership training, and all of it talks about accountability, and then you're looking around at the leaders above you and you're like, I don't see it anymore. I just don't see it anymore. And that's not to say that there are no leaders at any company who aren't modeling it, but I do have to say that that is one of my kind of pro tips for everybody is that if you enjoy the company you work at, but you start to notice that the leaders are shirking accountability, that's a red flag. It's a red flag for the health of the company. That company can never continue being healthy or continue to grow in a good way. Or if they're having problems, they can't get out of having the problems if the leaders aren't holding themselves accountable. It's just a fact. And so that is a red flag to look elsewhere. And if you've ever been at a company for a really long time, they change. Unfortunately, sometimes they change in ways that aren't so good. And so, one of, like I said, those key indicators of a company changing, not for the good, or if you're new to a company, something to look out for is do the leaders hold themselves accountable? And is it honest? Because accountability is something that they often fake, just like vulnerability. They'll take accountability for something smaller to avoid taking accountability for something bigger. That's even worse to me because then it's intentional. Like it's not just ego protection at that point. At that point, it's active manipulation. And so you'll see narcissists do this sometimes, but again, a lot of executives, of course, are narcissists. This just goes with it, but the territory. But I'm telling you, look out for that. Like if somebody really effed up big time and then they take accountability for something really, really small, that is manipulation. They know what they're doing. And that's a character flaw. And I know that not taking accountability is also a character flaw. I'm just saying that's worse. So that one's personally pretty gross to me because like I said, that is a core value of mine as a human being and as a leader. All right. So the dodging of accountability. And then authenticity is the same. What I wrote down on my notes, I'm looking at my notes right now, and the note I wrote for this one is authenticity. They don't know her. And it's true. It's just like vulnerability. So I have a couple different thoughts on authenticity. And at the surface level, it's easy to say that just like with vulnerability, the leaders above you are demanding authenticity of you, of the people who work for you. That's been huge in the workplace for a while. And we know that people want authenticity, but people want authenticity from their leaders too. People don't just want to show up and be asked to be authentic and not get the same thing in return. Because again, you can't build trust with one way authenticity, just like you can't build it with one way vulnerability. So I find it really disingenuous that leaders are asking us to be authentic when they themselves are so disingenuous. And I just go back to the point that everything is rehearsed. And at some point, if everything is rehearsed, then nothing is authentic. There's no authentic connection. There's no authentic reaction. There's no authentic collaboration where you get that magic in the moment where people are throwing ideas around. When someone is so constantly rehearsed, there is an artificiality for everything. They've polished off all the authenticity. And that's something that I struggled with from a very early time in my career. I really, really resisted going into leadership for a long time. And then even after I did, I had said I never want to get to a certain level in corporate America because there's a certain amount of artificiality that's required. And in some spaces, we call that putting on the corporate mask. And the more you rise in the organization, the more you put that mask on. But that's the thing about wearing masks is that the mask is the enemy of authenticity and the mask is covering your authentic self. And so early on, I wanted, I'm an ambitious person and I frankly want the title and the money that goes with the work that I do, but I didn't want those very senior titles because I didn't want to have to become that person. Because at that level, there are so many characteristics that like C-suite executives in corporate America at big companies have in common because they've had the authenticity kind of polished off of them along the way. And they're all putting on very similar masks. There's some personality differences. I'm not saying they're exactly the same person. There's so many things that they have as common behaviors between all of them, including like this faux vulnerability, this demand for authenticity, and just the unwillingness to show it themselves. I don't even know if they can anymore. And that is something I want to be really transparent with y'all about is that since I've left corporate America, it's been 9 months now. I have had to undergo a really seriously reflective and introspective process of doing the work to peel off those layers of artificiality that I had to gain just to get to the point that I was. Because at that point, you are actively reprimanded and punished if you aren't fitting the mold of the leadership. So again, I say that's not authenticity. And if you continue to rise within that structure, you're going to continue to have all of those things that make you you shaved off on the outside and have those masks put on. So I don't know. Like when I look back, I'm like, do I wish I'd stuck to my guns and not tried to get promoted? But I was learning so much and I enjoyed it. And like I said, I wanted the titles and the money that went along with what I was doing from a contribution perspective. But I do sometimes regret that I allowed myself to try and fit the mold. But even then I didn't. And I can say that not fitting it served me well with my clients because my clients, the reason I did so well with client work as a consultant is because they liked my genuine self. But when it came to internal work, I could not be that person. And when I was punished for it. I mean, literally punished for it. So, like I said, I do have empathy for these leaders because I know they're going through that same system. They're going through this grindstone that's just, shaving off everything that makes them them. But what I do have a beef with, the thing that we're talking about here, is they get to that level and then they demand authenticity from you. That is what I find so offensive, is because it is gaslighting you, frankly, into saying they want you to be your authentic self. But here's the second part of this, right? They are not authentic themselves. They're demanding authenticity, and it's impossible for you to succeed while being authentic. Like that's the rub. But the second piece of this is that whenever you're with these leaders who say they want you to be their I can't even say it. They say they want you to be your authentic self. It's you only get to be your authentic self as much as you're like them. You don't get to be your authentic self. So if you're around them and you try and take the mask off, and if they're taking their mask off, great. Again, it only works if you're like them in whatever way. If it's a country club crowd, you're a country club crowd authentically. And if it's, golf, then you better authentically be a golf person. I mean, I'm not kidding, by the way. It doesn't have to literally be golf and country clubs, but whatever it is that they see about themselves, that's what they want to see in you. And they would love it if it was authentically true. But if it's not, you will not be lifted up and rewarded, and you will be slowly moved out. And it's a shame. And again, it's not always superficial. I talked about this the other day for something else. It's not always the superficiality. It's the stuff on the inside. It's the kinds of schools, or it's whatever. It's whatever they value, basically. But you have to be like them in that way. So their demands for authenticity are, frankly, egregiously dishonest. So that is another big way. And yeah, I think I want to switch to something else really quick about leaders, because there's a lot on here and there was really something else I wanted to cover really quick. But in the meantime, I'm going to pause and take a drink really quick. And I'd love to know from chat, what are your reactions to what I've said so far? Is there anything that's really struck you, that's like resonated with you, or that you want me to expand on? Is there something I haven't touched on yet that you want to hear about? I want to hear from you in chat. So, like I said, let me know if you've experienced any of the things I talked about, or if any of them resonated with you, or if there's something on your mind that I haven't talked about yet. So, I'm going to take a drink while you hopefully put something in chat. And while I do that, I just want to say thank you for joining the live. I know it's been a crazy day for everybody in our country, and I just wanted to go live and give people an opportunity to come in and talk about how these issues affect us at work, basically, and what our perceptions are of leadership. So again, thank you so much for joining. And it's okay if you don't have anything to say in chat, but if you do, I really do want to hear from you. Also, I did notice last time that I had a bit of a chat delay, so I'm going to go ahead and start, and if something pops up, I don't mind. This is one that I think is going to be relatable to a bunch of people. I made a list of things that leaders lie about all the time. I know if I were still working in corporate, I would not be able to have this conversation, because I would be blacklisted or get in so much trouble. But yes, these are the things leaders actively lie to you about. Okay. The first one is, we care about your opinion. They don't. So this comes up a lot in town halls, or when companies are rolling out changes, or they've got org changes going on, or they're shifting direction or whatever. So what happens is that leaders will announce it, and they'll socialize it with the level under them, the level under them, the level under them, and then they'll do like a larger announcement. And even with the level under them and the level under that, which are fairly seniorist leaders in and of themselves, they still don't actually care about their opinions. And so anytime leaders are saying, we care about your opinion and we want to hear your voice, they do not. They do not care. That is a lie. That is a lie. Another one is, we want you to be happy. So a lot of times the executive leadership is telling, all the layers of the company that they really are there for their happiness, and that they are people first. And I just want to say, they want you to be happy in the sense that they want you to not cause trouble. Like, they want you to be happy enough to go along with what they're doing without causing them any consternation. And so with these two lies taken together, a lot of times executive leadership will entertain some discussion and dissent. And so that is to give the appearance that they're taking input, and that you are part of this decision and future direction that's being made. And I'm just telling you again, it is 100% artificial. It is 100% a lie. They do not want your input. They do not care if you're happy. They care that you don't cause trouble, more or less. And they will be patient and entertain a little bit of dissent in these like rollout meetings. They don't take any of that as input. Even if they take feedback about it, they don't do anything with it. They just don't care. And I just have to remind everybody that businesses exist to make money. And I don't care what company you work for, how progressive they are, how selfless they say they are, how much they say they're people first. They will never choose the people over profit. Like, except for that one guy in Seattle who, gave everybody that minimum, salary, like, and his company's doing well. Good for him. He's the exception. But I mean, I've worked for some companies and had, worked with some client companies that kept saying that they were like this. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, no, they're doing what they need to maximize their profits, and they're doing what they need to do so that you go along with it. They don't actually care about your happiness. I'm sorry to say that, but it is true. And I know I mentioned people first, but it's people first unless it impacts the bottom line. Now, I have worked with companies, I do have to say, that let the people first thing go on a little bit too long and did impact the bottom line. But when it came time to course correct, it wasn't people first anymore. Once they realized that it had gotten to the point where it was impacting profits, guess what changed? That's what changed, right? And they even said it. So I do have to point that out. The business always comes first, and you are lying to yourself if you don't believe it. But that's where this artificiality comes in, right? This is why it's so disingenuous, is because they're saying they're people first, but it's always business first. But then they're expecting everybody to act like the people first thing is true. Like, that is so gaslighty, and it frankly puts so much strain again on middle management, where middle management is being asked to behave in ways that senior leadership doesn't, because senior leadership isn't behaving in a people first way, but they're telling middle management, you need to behave this way. Like, it's not real, but you have to act like it. Oh my gosh, another big lie. This is I'm spilling the tea here. No company has an objective promotion process. Like, I do not care how objective they say it is. It is completely subjective. I have been in all these conversations. I've been in conversations like this with tons and tons of companies. I'm not just talking about one company here. Across the board, it is as subjective as it gets. And some places are fairly open that it's subjective and they don't even publish like a formal process. But other places really do their best to make it seem like it's objective and that it's all like metric based. It's never metric based, because there's always qualitative and quantitative goals and targets to get promoted. And as long as it's also qualitative and not just quantitative, by definition, it's going to be subjective, right? But what really gets me is the places that say that, and then they don't even stick to the qualitative measures. And by qualitative, I mean numbers. Like, you have to hit certain financial targets, like real metric based stuff. Like, they actually don't even enforce that. Like, if they want to promote somebody, they just promote them. And if they don't, they don't, even if they've hit all the numbers. So that's where I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't care what company you work for. I don't care how much they try and prove that it is an objective promotion process. It is not. And it's not just because we're human and that there's always going to be subjective elements. I'm telling you, they even ignore the qualitative often, not just exceptions, like often. So that's really sad. I have to admit, I drank the Kool-Aid on this one for a long time. And then as a leader, I enforced the company policy and I enforced like the processes, and I went by the number and I went by the qualitative as well as the quantitative measures. And then I have to admit, I also got punished for that because I was the only one doing it. So then people would get cranky with me for not getting promoted. I'm following the process and had to constantly defend it. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm going to make that face. And like I said, I think this one's still a little fresh for me because I don't care how many years it's been. I really did drink the Kool-Aid. And I don't know if it's because I'm a Virgo and I'm a bit of a rule follower, but it was really frustrating for me to learn that, oh no, people don't follow the rules. Nobody does. I'm the only one out here following the rules and trying to remind everybody what the rules are. And I'm the crazy one. Oh, that one still hurts. All right. So, yes. Oh, yeah. Culture, company culture. I think another one that everybody, when did that book come out? There are a lot of like corporate culture books that came out like 10 years ago. And that is when culture became like a required buzzword at a lot of companies, especially progressive ones. Not just identifying what your culture is, but talking about how passionate you are and how you protect the culture. And it's great when companies have good culture. It is. It's amazing. Like, when it works, it's amazing. I have been a part of some really amazing cultures. And I've also observed, and I think a lot of people have seen this, that there's a lot of companies that don't put their money where their mouth is about their culture. It's just buzzwords for them. And there's other companies that have had great cultures, but when the chips are down and they needed to make business decisions, they were okay sacrificing the culture to make those business decisions. So it's just like people first. It's culture first until it's not. And that's really unfortunate because if you have a great culture, you are a great company. You're gonna get great results, and people wanna work with you, good people. And the more you lose your culture, the more the good people leave. And the more the good people leave, the more the culture collapses because it's the people who sustain the culture. So as soon as you're willing to compromise culture, it is almost impossible to get it back. And so when companies say they care about culture, some of them don't mean it at all, and some of them mean it until it's inconvenient. And that is where, when I say our senior leaders are failing us, if you're getting to the point where the senior leaders are no longer living the culture and they're no longer talking about the culture in detail, that means the ship has sailed. And that's so sad because the senior leaders should be some of the most invested in maintaining the culture and in creating an infrastructure of leaders underneath them who also sustain the culture. So if they're not actively doing that, it's already gone. It may take a few years to play out. And like I said, as somebody who genuinely cares about doing amazing work with amazing people and who's been a part of some amazing cultures, to see that go away is so sad. And to watch leaders be a part of making it go away is even worse. Because how can I, as a leader, respect the leaders above me if they're inauthentic and if they're fake vulnerable and if they can't model the culture and if they can't coach and develop the people underneath them the way they're expecting their directs to do so? You just can't respect leaders like that. So, part of why I wanted to talk about this is to see what y'all are seeing out there and what disappointments you're having in leadership, and also to talk about how human and flawed leaders are. Because as long as we're putting leaders on pedestals, it's actually almost heartbreaking when we do see their flaws. And it's also hard to judge a company or the leaders you might be interviewing with to go work for if you aren't trained to identify the leader's strengths and weaknesses and to know what some of the common failures of leadership are, so you can look out for those as a red flag for that company, or in some cases just about that specific leader who you might be considering working for or already working for. I've known people at companies who are working for one of these leaders who have more flaws than not and are so miserable because they're unsupported and everything's like disingenuous and dishonest. And constant chaos and drama is a really good sign of this, by the way. And they've stayed within the same company but switched to a different leader and just had a completely different experience, right? Just night and day. And I'm happy for them. And so sometimes it really is just that leader and not the whole culture of leaders at a company. But like I said, what I want to do is start a dialogue about this so that people can have their eyes open and know what to look out for if you're interviewing in a company, if you're considering a boss, or if you're with your boss. Because I've also seen people get really disillusioned with the leader above them when I'm like, that flaw would be acceptable to me, but it's not acceptable to that person, and that's okay. But I do think that when we look at leaders, it's just like when we're evaluating anything else, you have to have open eyes and see the strengths and see the weaknesses and know what you can live with. But they're not going to change. At that level, they are who they are. And I know we talk about what's coachable and does feedback work, but if once someone's in senior leadership, they are who they are. They will not change even a little bit. They may flex something for you, but they will not fundamentally change. It's hard to get anybody to fundamentally change, but especially not a leader at that level, because what they're doing works for them. They won't change it. So I've got one more failure I want to talk about, and then we'll wrap up part one, and then I'll do another live with part two because I have literally 2 more pages of notes. So the last one I'm going to talk about with part one is a lack of transparency. And this is another one where I think that as you grow in an organization, obviously you learn what to be transparent about and what not to be transparent about and how to do it in appropriate ways. That's part of leadership, right? But one of the things that I'm noticing is that just like we talked about the grindstone polishing off your authenticity, it also polishes off the transparency, because if you don't take a stand on something, you won't have people get mad at you. Or if you're never transparent with people, they can't ever hold you accountable for that. And you can't ever offend anybody if you're not transparent. So I think some leaders, not all of them, some leaders really over rev on this, and they become absolutely not transparent, not just too subtle, because there's an argument that, hey, as you're rising through leadership, you need to be able to understand unspoken things and very subtle things for leadership. That is 100% true. But a true lack of trusting transparency is more than that. And I do think that there are some leaders who have just learned in their careers, right, wrong, or indifferent, that that is what serves them, is to not be transparent. But it does not serve their employees. And it can work with some employees, but I've seen many teams where you can have a leader who's not super transparent, and that will affect the leaders underneath them in very different ways. And unfortunately, I've seen leaders struggle because their leaders are not transparent with them. And we all know, that they're not being transparent. And I know we talked about promotions in another live, which is near and dear to my heart, but that's a big one about transparency, especially at the leadership level. Usually that's a very transparent conversation if you're on track or not on track. Very transparent and very easy as long as it's objective. But frankly, that's a sign that it's not objective, is if your leader won't be transparent about it. Think about that. So, if you are struggling with a leader who isn't transparent, there are ways to get them to open up. And, I am notoriously pushy. And so people tend to open up with me, but I'm also a vault. And so I have people all the time telling me things very transparently that they know won't ever go anywhere. So I have worked with leaders who are, some other people complain that they're not transparent, and that's not the experience I have with them. And part of that's my personality and how it meshes with theirs, and part of it's how I approach it, that I can get past that a little bit. I'm not tooting my own horn, because that does not work with everybody, I can tell you that, but there's some times where it does. So if you're struggling with a leader who isn't transparent, it's on you to like nudge them in ways that work and find out how to kind of get in their armor, if that makes any sense. But the problem's with them, not you. Just because there's things you can do with it doesn't mean you're the problem. It just means, hey, somebody else can have an issue, but it doesn't mean you don't have some tools to deal with it. So I'm big on creating my own tools to deal with problems, as you can tell, and also sharing those tools with you. But I do think that a leader who isn't transparent is setting their team up for failure, because they're not being transparent about goals. They're not being transparent about metrics. They're not being transparent about results. They're not being transparent about consequences. So people are often surprised by consequences because the leader wasn't transparent that there would be consequences, or what they were. Or the leader wasn't transparent that the person was having challenges that would cause them to face consequences at some point. And it's really unfortunate, because I've seen people demoted who didn't know why. I've seen people in very senior leadership levels who don't get promoted and don't know why, and thought they were getting promoted. That's why I bring it up all the time. I see this all the time. And I just see this where people are like, I don't know what my targets are. I don't know what I'm being held accountable for, because their boss is so not transparent. But like I said, for them, it's worked up until this point. They're not going to change it. And their mindset honestly is, if I never say this to anybody, then I can't get in trouble for it and I can't be held accountable for it. So why would they stop doing it, right? So there are so many challenges with leadership today. And before I wrap up, I do want to pause again and just give y'all an opportunity to react to anything I've said so far, or ask a question about anything I've said so far, if you want me to expand on anything, or if there's something you do want me to touch on, something you've seen or have a question about before we wrap up. Please do put it in chat. But I also want to reemphasize, this is a series, so this isn't your only opportunity. We will be continuing this conversation because there are a lot of leadership challenges today. And I'm just going to reemphasize, for those who maybe came in a little bit later, a lot of those are because of the particular kind of shift that we're seeing right now, which is the impact of AI, the reduction of middle management, the, boomers who are leaving the workforce and Gen Z coming into the workforce. Those are really significant cultural shifts within companies all at the same time, major technology changes. And, you know, I know I don't get into a lot of details about finances, but the change in interest rates 2 years ago impacted corporate spending as well and corporate behavior. So there's just a lot of things that are driving change right now, and our leaders just aren't equipped to support their organizations through these change. And in some ways, they're trying, but I think they're looking at the wrong things. I think that they're very focused on how the changes are affecting them and the company business, but not the company's people and the company's operations and how people work together. And that's really what matters. And when leaders take their eye off of that, everybody suffers. And if everybody suffers, the business suffers because you can't really separate the business from the people. You can't. You have to take care of both because one will 100% impact the other. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. This was part one of our leadership series about how our leaders are failing us today. I'm Gabby from She Makes It Work. I've really enjoyed having this conversation, and I'd love to see you all on the next live stream. So have a great Wednesday night, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.